This is the Kitsap Sun Editorial Board, and we're talking to candidates for the 23rd District House seat in the legislature. Representative Drew Hansen, we'll let you begin. Take 2 minutes to introduce yourself.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me in this morning. I'm Drew Hansen. I've represented the 23rd District since I was appointed in 2011, first elected in 2012. The past term, the governor signed, I think, 8 of my bills into law, which is, I haven't checked, but it probably puts me in the top 1 to 3% of all legislators, certainly first-term legislators. And it's particularly noteworthy because I'm a Democrat. The Senate is controlled by Republicans, so I got 8 pieces of legislation through a chamber controlled by the opposing political party. And most of these relate to jobs, one way or another. I mean, I said 2 years ago when I was here, that's what I would focus on. That's what I have focused on. I'll just highlight a couple of them. One, a couple big bills to get derelict and abandoned boats out of the water. This might not seem like a huge deal, but if one of those old fishing boats goes down by our shellfish beds, by Taylor, or up in Port Madison, a lot of people are out of work. That's what happened in Whidbey Island, and so I worked very closely with Norma Smith, the Republican representative from Whidbey Island, on 2 big bipartisan bills to get these boats out of the water. And we passed them, and they worked. Second, a big package to improve AP computer science in the high schools. I was working with Chad Magendas, who's a Republican from Issaquah, on that. We got a big bill passed and got some money behind it, and I've heard, including just this morning, that in part because of these bills, there are schools where AP computer science enrollment has doubled in the past school year, which is neat. It means your kids are going to go on and get real good jobs and do well. Third, a bill to help veterans get into the college classes that they need, and I won't go into detail about that, but it's related to some sort of thematically related to some veterans work I did with the Veterans Advisory Board in LAIF related to veterans eligibility. But we can talk about that in more detail. I've enjoyed being in the legislature. I've enjoyed doing concrete bipartisan work to make some small but real progress on training people for jobs and protecting jobs. And I would love to be able to continue.
All right.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity for the paper to reach out to inform the voters. There's a dearth of knowledge on their part as to who we are and what we represent. But I describe myself, I am describing myself, having refined it, as a reform conservative. I am a Republican, and I'm a proud Republican, and I adhere to a good part of the Republican plank. However, as a reform conservative, my major concern is that all is not well in the kingdom. My opponent chronicled a number of very good bills that he's working on, and there are others working on many, many good bills. However, at the core, Olympia faces some serious problems where, in fact, reform needs to go on. Now, one of them, and we'll no doubt probably get a chance to talk about it, and I had an editorial, a letter to the editor on the subject, calling the Washington State ferry problems a meme, as an example of the kind of reform that needs to go on there, but it needs to go on in the greater Washington State Department of Transportation, Department of Social and Health Services, and in the regulatory domain. My background, I retired from the military. I was in military public service for 30 years. I was a commanding officer of 6 units, communications, naval coastal warfare, planning, worked for the commandant. I know how to follow orders, I know how to lead people, I know how to lead, and I've got good work skills. I also know when to be insubordinate. I'm an extremely independent person. I will not be anybody's backbencher. And particularly in moving for reform, it will be a bipartisan effort that's needed, but unless we do that, we will continue to pass nice bills, good bills, nice bills to have, but at its core, we'll continue to have problems. Besides my military, in conclusion, I've been a businessman for 30 years. My wife and I started a real estate investment firm. We provide affordable rental housing in Kitsap and King County. I know hard work, I know regulation. A few can work harder than me. I have, get up early and go to bed late. That, in part, I want to continue my public service that I did with the Coast Guard, where I was a citizen sailor, and now I want to be a citizen legislator. And final is the world that I travel in is the fine world of the Walmarts, the Targets, the Home Depots, not the Washington Athletic Club. I'm not an elitist. I don't know if I call myself a populist, but I'm really a simple guy and I work very hard, and I think that's what the legislature needs, is a small, practical businessman calling for reform. Thank you.
Sometimes I save this question till later, till we get through the issues, but I think it's appropriate to ask it now, since you're talking about, when you led off, you said you're Republican, but you disagree with some things on the party platform. And you mentioned how you managed to get bills through with support of Republicans. I've been asking candidates, tell me somewhere where you look at your own party and say, this is where I'm different from you guys, and I want to lead us in a different direction. And then a similar question is, where do you look at the other party and say, hey, they're doing that right, I'd like to join with them on that kind of an issue. Where do you see a difference with your own party, but then also something you see in common with Republicans, and I'd like to work together to find that? Let Jim go first.
Okay, I'd say difference with my own party. My own party has dug their heels in, and appropriately, saying as far as a gas tax, they're very much opposed to the gas tax. I'm not enthusiastic about a gas tax. I'm really not. However, the transportation problems we have, of which the Washington State Ferries just being a small part of it, is going to require that we in fact have a transportation plan. And as part of that transportation plan, it's not going to be paid for with funny money. We can't mint our own money, so there's going to have to be a tax. So I think my party seems to have been warming up to the notion, moving closer to the Democrats, to the fact that there has to be a transportation plan this time, and furthermore, that there has to be, as part of that, a tax, a gas tax, 10.5 or whatever it is, 11 cents proposed. So in that sense, I'd say I am closer to the Democrats in agreeing that this has to be paid for and that it's time to have that. As to where the second part of it would be what I find about the Democrats that I agree with. David, was that it?
Yeah, is there anything that they're working on that you say, I could get on board with that kind of effort?
Well, I frequently take a skeptical view about global warming in general. I mean, it's a lot of hype and not really conclusive things. However, in doing my research, preparing for this, and part of this campaign, some of the things about that Governor Gregoire began about the acidification having to do with the oceans and worrying about the shellfish industry and things like that, I think that that was a good move on her part, and I think Governor Inslee is continuing that to some extent, that I think we should be concerned with it. However, Governor Inslee has gone totally proposing with his low carbon standard, whatever, emission standards or something like that, that would amount to between $1 and $22 more per gallon for gas. I got to draw my line on that. But I do think that as far as the Democrats' interest in the environment, and not that the Republicans are not interested in it too, but since they have been in power for a long time and they control the governorship, I would certainly work with the governor on that.
So, for the first question first, drones. This is an issue that consumed a huge amount of time at the end of the legislative session, but didn't get reported a lot. Our party, Democratic Party, brought forward a big bill to regulate government use of drones that would have required, in its first draft, specific permission from the legislature every time, like the Washington State Patrol wanted to buy a drone. It had a specific set of uses. You can only use drones for this and not something else. And I looked at this bill and thought, look guys, we have a Constitution, we have a Fourth Amendment, we have a judiciary. When we developed parabolic microphones or fixed-wing aircraft, we did not set up some brand new regulatory system specifying exactly how they can be used and exactly how they can't be used. And that strikes me as very unwise, because what happens if the Department of Natural Resources realizes they want to use a drone for something not on the list? What if they want to figure out if somebody's dumping on public lands and it's hard and dangerous to send some agent into some forest? It's a lot easier to fly a drone over. So I spoke out in caucus against it. I spoke out on the floor against it. It passed overwhelmingly with overwhelming support from my party. The governor then vetoed it. So I was happy about that, and I'm hoping, we'll come to a more reasonable approach to this type of technology in the future. On your second question, where I agree with the Republicans, look, obviously, the derelict vessels bill, my AP computer science bill, these aren't, they have my name on them. They're Democratic bills in the sense that I'm a Democrat, but the content of them is agreed bipartisan to a T. Otherwise they wouldn't have gone through the way they did. In a more general level, I do think, there are plenty of Republican bills that I have signed on to as a co-sponsor. I'll give you one example. In the Higher Ed Committee, we had a bill by Chad Magandaz from Issaquah, the same gentleman I'm working with on the computer science shortage, to produce a report of what kind of return on investment each degree from a college can give you. So the average pharmaceutical major can make X, the average Russian literature major is making Y. And this struck me as very useful information to gather for parents and for students. There was great hostility within my party on the higher education committee to this bill. They said, you can't reduce the value of an education to how much money someone makes, which is true, but it's useful to know what kinds of economic return you have for what kinds of majors and what kinds of schools. As a parent, because I have 2 small kids, I'm going to want to know that in 18 years. And the bill wasn't able to move, and I was very unhappy about that. I was a co-sponsor of the bill, and I would absolutely support it again if it comes up again.
What's your response? Jim mentioned some of the climate change legislation that's coming through and the carbon emissions specifically. Where do you fit with what Inslee's saying on those issues?
Yeah, look, I think unquestionably the climate is changing. Unquestionably it's changing in part because of human action. It's just a question of what we can realistically do. There's a big coordination problem with doing anything on climate, whether it's unilaterally as the United States, with India and China not necessarily doing anything, or unilaterally as Washington State, with Oregon and California and Idaho maybe doing something and maybe not. I do think one area where Governor Inslee is moving, which is very sensible, is to try to get the state off its dependence on coal. That started with Phil Rockefeller, Christine Rolfes' predecessor in this seat, with the negotiation to shut down the state's, over time, the state's last coal-producing power plant, TransAlta. But I think that is an area where we can do it on our own, and it's not going to create some problems across borders. Most of the governor's proposal, he got a lot of detail to flesh out on these proposals still, I think it's fair to say. So, we will see what he comes up with. I'm glad he's paying attention to it. It is a huge problem. I have questions about what we can do unilaterally, but I'm happy he's attending to it.
Are things like that touch the specific customer, like higher prices for gas, is that something you're willing to say it may be worth doing to achieve some of these goals, or where do you kind of draw the line on, well, we can't go that far?
Look, I voted for a transportation package last year that included a gas tax hike. I drive a lot of miles to and from Olympia. I despise the amount of money it costs to fill my tank, right? But there aren't a lot of other options for how we fund the ferries in particular. And if we don't do something like that, we're going to end up with cuts in service. Now, I'm answering your question about the revenue source, but that's, by analogy, I need to see what the proposal is and what the impacts are. But certainly I don't have some ideological commitment to never raise the gas tax.
It sounds like you both mentioned the gas tax now and saying, if I understand it right, it would be an option worth talking about. That's where you both kind of are with that.
Well, I agree that it's an option, but it's an option that's going to be put in a bit of a straitjacket as to what it's going to be spent on. The answer is not just to put the gas tax in and then develop the transportation plan where it can go for bicycle trails or beautification or light rail, going over the Columbia River. Anyway, these various projects that would be nice to have, but they're not core issues that are going to help mobility within the state. I'm warm to the notion that we're going to have to pay for this, and I'm certainly very warm to the notion we need to do something. But it's not going to be a pig in a poke as to what it is we do. And the plan that had been voted was not very specific as to what it was going to be spent on.
Right.
Or wasn't those core issues having to do with increasing mobility.
And that was the question I was just about to ask here. What are the didn't get through last time, I imagine there'll be some sort of similar package that comes around this time. One of the things, you're a reform candidate, so I'd like to hear you say, here are some of the reforms I'd like to see in DOT or wherever you think it needs to make you comfortable if you were to go along with something like that. And then from a Democratic side, what reforms do you think you're going to need to offer, and which ones are you comfortable saying, we can do this to make some kind of a deal come together? Let you go.
Okay, but I just want to, as I understand, we can have some throwback to a previous one. I didn't get a chance to make just an interject as far as this low carbon fuel standard that the governor's proposing. Washington State controls, the emissions that we do as far as carbon is 1/3 of 1%. And the governor says that he wants us to be a model. He wants us to be a leader. Ka-ching, ka-ching. We cannot afford $1 to $22 a gallon to just drive down the emissions for that small return. Okay, so, sorry. And then your question, David?
The question is, if there's going to be a transportation package, one of the things that the Republicans said is laid out some reforms that they'd like to see before being comfortable with anything else. I mean, it's a common thing. Before asking for more money, how are you going to earn back the trust of the voters? But frankly, the ferry system needs to do that, so other agencies need to do that. What are the reforms that you put at the top of that list? Here's what we'd like to see if we're ever going to talk about a gas tax, if we're going to talk about another way to fund this.
Well, in terms of transportation, in terms of reform, and I'm not necessarily linking it because reform does not happen overnight. And if you hinge the transportation plan to reform, you're never going to get to the transportation plan because reform is a tougher nut to crack. But the Washington State ferries is certainly one that is ripe for reform. I was in a recent forum with another candidate, a different paper, and the person that I was running against said that the ferry service is by and large pretty happy, and people are happy with that. They're not. Things are seriously wrong there. So, in terms of a transportation plan, they've got to put, they've got to get that Washington State ferry under control as far as getting credible, talented people at the helm in terms of operations, in terms of others. The managers have to be held accountable. It's a bit of a hobby horse that I raise frequently, but that's the ferries must be built on a national basis, on a competitive basis, much like the Navy and the Coast Guard bids out their vessels. The notion that Viger Industries is the only sole bidder that we have in this area, who's also a heavy donor to the Democratic Party, is just not right. That needs to be changed. And it's not just me. I can't tell you who our state auditor is, the Democrat, but the 2013, his report, the performance audit report on the ferry service, ferry service said the same thing, that the ferries need to be built, need to be open to competition to be built anywhere else. As far as other things, Mr. Hansen is in the legislature. He can cite probably chapter and verse of various things that were in the bill that they proposed last time that didn't pass this time. I can't do that. But I come back to the general operating overview is that whatever's done has to help the state's commerce, has to help mobility, has to clear congestion. If it doesn't do those things, it doesn't pass muster. And I alluded to the business about the light rail going over the Columbia River. And what was driving that wasn't the need to have light rail. It was that the people on the other side, on the Vancouver side, wanted to tie into the rail system. And as a result, the bridge configuration was totally goofed up and it was hurting business that was upriver. That was a case of a transportation plan where the tail was wagging the dog, and unfortunately was stopped. So that's what I would want to see. I can't give you the specifics. I can live with it, but we are overdue. We have bridges that are going down, the one up in the Skagit River and the other things. And with transportation, as with probably Ben Franklin came up with it, his aphorism, but stitch in time saves nine. So the longer we go on that, the more expensive it's going to cost us in the future.
So I'll just focus on the ferries for the sake of brevity. I've been a regular ferry commuter for 10 years. And I've taken hundreds of ferry trips. 99.99999% of those trips are without incident. That's true for most of the many thousands of people who take the ferries in this state. And having said that, though, this summer's been terrible. And the summer's been terrible in a lot of ways. The one that I've spoken out about, and I was emailing George Kapachi, the interim director of the ferries, immediately afterwards, is just basic customer service. That day when the Tacoma went down and a bunch of people were stranded in Seattle, you just have to tell people what's happening, which they did. That day when they got the wrong loading numbers on the boat from Bremerton for the Seahawks preseason game. I mean, it is incomprehensible to me that the sort of basic level of customer service you get from an airline, where if the plane is delayed, they tell you what's going on and how long it's going to take and what they're doing to fix it, we did not get from the ferries. Now, I was not the only legislator who got on the horn with the director. Like, they are doing better. I mean, you probably noticed the next preseason Seahawks game, they had a bunch of people flooding the zone at the terminals, not to use football terminology, and they're getting that message about customer service, but that's something that we're going to keep pushing them on, because thank God things don't go wrong that often, but when they do need to do a better job than they're doing to keep people informed. Now, in terms of more just broader sort of systemic issues, we've had any number of stem to stern reviews of Washington State ferries. One of the first things I did when I got appointed was read them all. It's about 18 inches of paper, okay? The general conclusion is that compared to other large ferry systems that carry lots of people, like BC ferries, our ferry system's pretty well run. If you're on the Ferry Community Partnerships email distribution list, you'll see we regularly get emails from articles in the British Columbia newspapers talking about how bad their ferry system is and how good ours is. So it looks bad to us because we're so dependent on it, and I was stranded in Seattle with everyone else when that boat went down. But generally speaking, the ferries appear to be, at least according to the benchmarks that people who know more about this than I do look at, doing reasonably well. Having said all that, we have been working to get rid of this idea on vessel construction that we design a vessel in-house and then ship it out to someone else to build it, which tends to cause a lot of problems. I think we have now successfully basically gotten rid of that. Number two, when we had this Build in Washington conversation about 2 years ago related to the ferries, and I said, look guys, we're in the middle of building a 3-ferry cycle. The dumbest thing we could do right now from a fiscal standpoint would be to put that out to bid brand new, because then you lose the efficiencies that come from building multiple boats. Every boat you build is cheaper than the last one because you have the molds up, the crew knows what they're doing, you save some money, and that's in fact what happened. Now though that's over, and the House passed a bill, which I supported, that says that in situations where a bid comes in over 5% of what the Washington State Ferries in-house engineer says it should be, their estimate for the construction cost is, we can bid it out nationwide, which is perfectly appropriate. So I think that is something that did not make it through the Senate. That is something that will come back last year. I'm going to vote for it again. Now that we're in between 2 different procurement cycles, we can look at doing that in a way that's not going to cost us a bunch of money. Now, is it going to be half as much? No, it is not going to be half as much to build a boat in Mississippi as it is here. I mean, that is just fiction. Like, as any manufacturer is now learning, as we start bringing back manufacturing capacity to the United States, because you get better results if you have supervisors on the shop floor with other people. Like, you do get efficiencies from doing it all at once with a skilled crew of people who know it before. Having said that, let's just see if there are other bids out there that are dramatically better, and if so, we'll look at them. I think that's perfectly fair.
But is that going to be enough throughout? I still need to ask about the entire, I think all of DOT, because when you say we have this big backlog of things that's coming up, the state's got to figure out a way to pay for these things and get highway projects done, some bridge things. What do you think it's going to take to get back to that stage?
Oh, look, I mean, there's no, like, with respect to my colleague, it was real clear what the transportation package would have invested the money in if we passed it. There was actually a bill. Like, it had the revenue source, it had how we were going to spend it. On the ferry system, I'll go to the more general question. Well, on the ferry system, if we passed that bill, we would have gotten existing levels of service with no cuts for the next 12 years, which is a huge deal because, as you all know, you all end up running stories every spring about how the ferries are under attack. we would have done the most urgent maintenance needs in the system for both fleet and the rotting pilings under Coleman Dock, and we would have built the third boat. So in any event, we got another bill to build the third boat, but that's what we would do on the ferries. Generally speaking, I mean, that's what the transportation package was. We haven't been able to clear the big backlog because we haven't been able to pass a revenue source for it. Like, we're barely able to keep the ferries afloat, no pun intended, as it is, and every year we have to fight them for them. So without a new revenue source, we're not going to be able to make meaningful progress on fixing roads and fixing bridges and doing basic infrastructure that we probably should have done about 3 years ago, but we weren't able to get it through.
So if you're working with Republicans this year, you bring this great plan forward again. No, we won't do the revenue. We won't do the revenue. What's going to be the key that says if that's how you believe we have to have it done? There's going to have to be some kind of, okay, we can do this much, but we're going to find a savings here. We're going to make a change here. We're going to completely do this part of it differently. Where are you willing to go to? Where do you think you might need to go to make a deal like that happen?
I mean, look, on transportation, we've been delighted to do any innovations that save money. I mean, look at this. There's a Larry Sequist bill on the ferries, I think, that does that talks about the building Washington cap. Like, we'll do any of this. It is very difficult to identify ways to save billions of dollars, right? I mean, we can get tens of millions of dollars here and there, bring them. I mean, we look for those and we do them when we find them. But I think at a general level, it's just a fairy tale to say we're somehow going to be able to fix our bridges and our highways through operational efficiencies that we are mysteriously going to find in DOT. And no one's coming with billions of dollars of operational efficiencies to the table. If they were, that'd be delightful, right? I mean, that's great. Like, I don't want to pay more in gas taxes, but it doesn't seem that that's realistic. So given that, the revenue package looks like not the only way to go.
Good. That's an interesting straw man, because I don't think anybody's proposing that the transportation plan is going to be paid with just finding efficiencies in the Washington State Department of Transportation. But even though we've probably beat the poor Washington State ferries to a pulp, just back for a second, they've got an aging fleet. They need to be replaced, and this is from the Blue Ribbon studies done by the past two governors. Aging fleet, once every 3 years, they've got to be replaced. There's endemic corruption within the ferry service. They have it having to do with ticket takers, people getting fired, people putting on leave, little stuff. Mr. Hansen talks about what he refers to as the Nordstrom's level of service. That's fine. People in Seattle, it's kind of like what they say about the Italians, if they can make the trains run on time. Okay, there's more to the problems of the ferry system than just customer service. Poor designs. Vessels that are designed that still continue to list. Brand new vessels that come out, cars are going on and they're banging the bottom of the cars and they knew the defects. Having to do with corruption, having to do with the unions and who mans them and who gets overtime, who got out. I did some research. There's a whole lot of, what was something on the waterway, fiasco on the waterways was one of the stations. Yeah, and then, okay, but back to, I think your question.
Stick on that one, because what you've done is, obviously you're citing stuff that has been reported and made public. How does the legislature start to address that?
Well,
if you feel that it's a cultural
as a former military person, whether I can get it out of me or not, I don't know. You have to have two things to make an organization work right, and I can just think of my Coast Guard. One, you have to have great leadership, leaders who have vision, that are credible, that are honest, and that are tough. And also you have to have an organization that's not broken. And the ferry service, in my opinion, notwithstanding the fact, and Mr. Hansen's right, 99% of the time the ferries run fine. That doesn't mean that like the house has got a great veneer and the paint job looks great, doesn't mean that there's a lot of rot. So to answer your question, David, so you need senior leadership. They've got vacancies in who are the directors of the ferry service. The managers on the various divisions are not being held accountable. As far as the counters, ferry boats are not running and being skipped over because people didn't show up. That is totally unacceptable. So that's the ferry thing, and I digress to that, but just coming back to the broader Washington State Department of Transportation, there are other things that could be done that have been resisted, having to do with labor rates that are established, and again, this is all, I love labor, I love unions, my parents were in unions, my grandfather was a firefighter chief, so I have a lot of respect for them, but unions can also work against bringing innovation in. So you have labor rates that are established here in the Puget Sound area that are applied in different parts of the state that distort what the cost is. Apparently, Washington State Department of Transportation, when they buy materials and they do work, they pay sales tax on it. Talk about churning the account. That seems a bit of a mystery to me. And also, we need to have public, with the ferry service. This is heretical, and Mr. Hansen will probably go after it. But having public-private partnerships in certain segments of the Washington State Department of Transportation, as far as the roads and taking care of things like that, bridges or toll roads and whatnot, and also, as the auditor's report, 2013, said, to look at having to do with certain parts of the ferry service also.
You're in favor of outsourcing certain parts of the ferry service?
Well, opening it up. Opening up. Apparently, the governor's created something called limited docking. I can't remember the term. It's just escaping now. But they've already created something. Being mindful that some of the ferry terminals and some of the docks that belong to the Washington State Ferry could be used by other private contractors at certain select times, perhaps for overflows or seasonally, with supervision from the state. The state isn't just sending it out such that you get shoddy performance or people getting killed and the state just says, I didn't know that happened. The state still has to be in the driver's seat. But part of that they can farm out. And just one other thing about the ferry, I thought was interesting, that in the last 14 years, the ferry salaries, and I'm not talking about the big people at the front office who are big bucks, but I'm talking about the union people, has gone up twice the rate of inflation over the last 14 years. So what we're seeing is, much like we get in higher education, ever increasing overhead cost on a system that's precariously balanced to try to find the right break point that you don't drive people crazy and they can still afford to use the ferry system. So anyway, but as far as the Department of Transportation, a few of those things, and a great one as an example of how terrific the Department of Transportation is doing is Big Bertha. I heard it move 3 feet yesterday.
Okay, so be all right now.
Yeah, it's like.
Let's change topics and talk about education, because that's the other one that we're asking everyone about. We'll start with Drew. You're heading into a session where you're going to, no matter what the Supreme Court says in this thing that they heard yet the other day, $1 billion, something like that, is what the legislature is going to have to find. What's the steps when you think through this thing that's looming in front of us? How do you start to address that problem philosophically? How do you think we pay for what the McCleary is saying needs to go into that in the next biennium?
Sure. So, I mean, it's the most important question the legislature faces. The Supreme Court has ordered us to spend more money on education. I mean, it hasn't ordered us to like tinker in some new way with the schools or put in some new curriculum. It's ordered us literally to spend a lot more money than we're spending. And that number can be between $1 billion to $3 billion. It's a big number. It starts with a B. The reason there's some flex in it is the Supreme Court sort of shifts the contours of what the mandate is for reasons we don't need to go into. I think, so look, we don't have an option not to do it, because if we don't do it, we're going to be in contempt. And as a lawyer, I would prefer not to be held in contempt. There are basically 3 options, I think, for how to fund the McCleary obligation. Number one is you take a certain set of the new revenue that's coming into the state and you dedicate it to education. Sounds good. The problem is, with the population growing in the state, the new revenue that's coming as the economy bounces back allows us to do what we're doing now again. I mean, in budget terms, it's the maintenance level. Population's going up, inflation is going up. We have a new Supreme Court decision about boarding the mentally ill in ERs. It's going to cost money. We have fire costs. All of that means you can't just rely on new tax revenues from the economy's recovery to solve your McCleary problem. The second is some big structural changes to the tax system, B&O tax reform, a capital gains tax, a property levy swap, where a statewide levy swap would replace certain portions of the local property levies. There's a lot of talk around this. None of these options is at a sufficient level of detail to be able to say if they're a good idea or a bad idea. Third is a combination of loophole closures and maintaining temporary taxes during the recession that expired. We can raise about $1 billion by doing that, by closing the bottled water sales tax loophole. Bottled water, you buy an orange juice, you pay sales tax. You buy bottled water, you don't pay sales tax. That's not real rational. It costs us to the tune of, I mean, it's in the tens of millions, it's not some small number. You can add up enough of those loopholes, plus maintaining a temporary surcharge that we had in the recession on the B&O rates paid by people like me in the law business, and raise about $1 billion. The reason I'm being so specific about this is that we actually passed that budget out of the House last year. This was the House Democratic budget proposal to start making progress on the McCleary obligation. If we had done that, we would have put $1 billion of real money towards funding the schools the way the Supreme Court said. We did not get any support in the Senate, and it died. But some combination of those second and third options, I think, are likely to be our path forward on McCleary.
Yeah, David, just restate the question. I'm very interested in what Mr. Hansen said, but I'm not sure which, which rabbit to chase after.
Okay, well, I'm asking you, with the no need to put $1 billion or more into education next session, where do you start? What's your philosophy on how we start to do that as a legislature?
Okay. Yeah, and I did read that it's, first of all, I think it's unfortunate that the Supreme Court got into this matter. I'm not an attorney. I prefer not to have our legislators held in contempt. The court is involved. I think that they should concentrate on judicial issues and let the legislators concentrate on the legislation issues. Before I get to the point, but just directly to the point, for the past 20 years, the Democrats have been in control, by and large, of the Washington government. And for that period of time, education has been greatly underfunded. Case in point, or a finding of the court that they've stated as such, that it's been. This is a statistic, it's just non-education spending dominated growth over the past 30 years. If you look at the lower grade, here's 30 years, and this is the education spending uptick, and this is the all other government spending. So, in other words, we've short-shrifted education for a long period of time. Okay, so how do we get out of this? I think, first of all, we need to, the legislature needs to come into session, and perhaps a special session. And the first thing, and the only thing that they're doing, first order of business, first head of line privilege, is education. That gets taken care of. And that gets taken care of to the satisfaction of what the court is demanding out of us. And that's going to leave the rest of the pie running a little short. So they're going to have to make some other cuts in some other areas. Now, my opponent here mentioned the possibility of loopholes. He talked about a very qualified or sort of a surgical loophole closures. The other lady running in this for the other seat, Ms. Appleton, she talks about wholesale closures of all these particular so-called loopholes. It sounds like it's easy money, but they're not tax loopholes. They were tax preferences. And they came into being for a variety of reasons to delicately balance an extremely complex budget that we have. And I read that in 2012, there were 565 so-called tax preferences, of which the benefit to the public was in excess of $100 billion. So yeah, I mean, again, this is my straw man. Shutting all those down, and suddenly you're just awash in lots of money, as the court was threatening to do, would really harm people. Or selectively, you say, we'll just aim it at business and just make, we'll just we'll let people get their tax-free food and medicine and things like that, but we'll just go after business. Well, also, it happens to be that Washington State is one of the highest tax rates for business to begin with. So if you gorge that ox, that also is going to come back and hurt the individuals. Whether or not there are one or two loopholes that could be so-called preferences that could be closed, of course there can. And there should be sunset laws, and they should be monitored carefully as to whether they meet their missions, and if not, they should be jettisoned. So, okay, so we're still short a bunch of money for education. They're going to come up with it. They have to come up with it. I'm not there. Mr. Hansen or myself will be wrestling with how to do that. But one thing we should not do is to take the money and throw it at an education system that produces 30%, I think what the dropout rate was, 40% dropout rate. 35 or 40% of the kids that go to community colleges have to take remedial English and mathematics. In other words, we have an education system, and I'm not talking about Bainbridge. We're okay there. You know, we can pay our way. I'm talking about the rest of the state, where our performance, our state performance for education, sends one clear message: do not inject money and continue doing the same thing. Period. And it's a bigger question. But the education system needs reform. It seriously needs reform. We're now in the 21st century. A lot of the models we have for our education system is still 18th century, 19th century. Things can be changed.
Okay, so that's an incredibly complex thing that you just suggest. We would all agree on that.
Which part of it? Probably all of it.
Your last statement.
Oh, about reforming the education system.
And no one will disagree with that either. Everyone would say yes, there's things we can do better. That's the nature of it. If you're sitting in Olympia in January, what's the bill that you're going to say? I'm going to talk to a counterpart over here, and we're going to file something that makes things better in the classroom, or gets you taking the first step towards that. What would it be? What is the legislature's view of that?
That's a tough one. I mean, obviously that's a tough one as far as a specific bill.
Or an idea. I mean,
again, the idea is there have been, charter schools was one that was brought about, and over much fighting and much bickering and much saying the sky is going to fall, that charter schools was instituted. So that is an example of where change can come about. We can also use technology. My daughter is taking some mathematics. She uses this thing called Khan Academy. And it's basically world-class mathematics education on the internet, available to anybody, any school, no matter how great the teacher is or not, for free. So using technology on that. I also think that the school systems, as far as we have 279 school districts, I very much believe in individual control. But I've got to believe, and I know, that a lot of that is top-heavy. We're not getting enough money down to the teachers at the pointy end of the spear, and we have a lot of people in the office, you know, just whatever, providing the upper office support, which is chewing up a lot of money, which means whatever money goes into the system, you know, you put a rush of money into the system, out of the spigot comes significantly less than that. We have to clean those pipes up, that more comes out the end to the teachers. And finally, Mr. Hansen mentioned some funding issues and ways to do that. That's very complex. I won't even go there. I have no idea what it needs to be. But somehow they have to level the playing field, that places like Bainbridge that have lots of dough just can't pass special levies and we're home free and everybody else is suffering.
Yeah, I think that's right. You're going to ask the question in a second, but I do want to push on one other thing you said. You used the analogy of a pie, and if we do a special session, pie shrinks for everything else that's left that would come after education. What do you think shrinks? Oh, what do you start leaving off? Because that's well,
there's only so much covers, and so much bed to cover.
Correct.
Okay. Not to either dodge the question or punt the ball. That's something. It's going to be in the social service realm. And a pet one that I have, this is just for illustrative purposes. 2 sessions ago, Bainbridge Island managed to get $600,000, $800,000. I'm not sure if it's through the fine help of Ms. Rolfes. Ms. Appleton claim for it. So they could build an art museum on Bainbridge Island. That kind of pork funding spread over the state sucks money away from taking care of the critically needed in the social service programs. So if you can tighten that up and not be engaged in that, you take care of education first and foremost, and everybody else probably has to take a little bit of a haircut. And an income tax is not the answer, despite what Jerry Lard said in yesterday's paper, or today's paper.
Actually, I'm going to ask your opinion on that too. But first, the question I asked Jim was, other than the funding, what do you think the legislature steps can take? What steps can the legislature take? You're not meddling in classrooms and saying this is exactly what you do, but there are certain things. There are certain things that you could say this would be smart. This is a way that we can help on the ground.
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple examples, either things that I've supported recently or working on right now. Number one, I supported a big bill to use open source textbooks in college high school classrooms. Textbooks are a scam. That industry is a scam. And we can save a lot of money by promoting open source online resources for textbooks. That was a bill I strongly supported a few years ago. We put it into place. We are saving tens of millions of dollars each year thanks to that kind of work. Number two, something I'm working on right now is making sure kids don't take unnecessary classes making sure kids don't take unnecessary classes in college that don't lead to a degree. This is sort of inside baseball, but we do have areas where kids, for example, want to be a computer science major and they're transferring from community college and they show up at Western Washington University. Turns out they've taken all these classes they don't need to take, and they have not taken CS1 or Introduction to Data Structure that they do need to take. I raised this with our community college board a few months ago. I was told this is not a problem. I then went and talked to the heads of the computer science departments at 3 of our state universities and said, is it really true that students come to you completely prepared from a 2-year community college degree and they've taken the right courses? And they said, no, 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 no. We went back to the state board. They now have come around to our way of thinking about this, and we're going to restructure how we advise kids at the community college level so they're not taking unnecessary courses, particularly in the CS field. A third one, kind of related to these, is to make sure, kids' schedules are really crowded these days. We have new requirements on them in high school. It's hard to pack in everything that you want to pack in, especially if you're not the kind of kid who learns by sitting in a classroom and having a teacher talk to you, but you're the kind of kid who learns by tearing apart some 4-cylinder engine and putting it back together. And there's a lot of kids who learn better that way. These kids sometimes have a hard time taking these classes. For example, Introduction to Fundamentals of Engineering, the great auto shop class that Tyler Hunt used to teach at CKI. Like these types of classes, because they don't count necessarily as math or science or English or a graduation requirement. So I've been part of an effort that went over this past summer and we're continuing into the fall related to course equivalency is sort of the technical name for it. Making sure that if you do have an auto shop class with some pretty hardcore math content, because you have to, that it can count in appropriate circumstances to fulfill your geometry requirement or whatever it is. It takes a lot of work, it's really complicated, but what it does at the end of the day is it opens up pathways to learning for kids who learn differently than kids who like to learn sitting in a classroom and listening to a lecture.
Oh, is an income tax ever something we'll need to go to for education funding?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, you'd have to, there's a debate about whether you need to amend the Constitution to do it. Even if you don't, you need to get it. Any tax increase needs to be something that can be held at the ballot, because we'll all get to vote on it, like it, whether we like it or whether we hate it. Just given the history, that doesn't seem like something that's going to happen anytime soon.
Is it something you'd be in favor of?
I mean, no, because we have other options we haven't exhausted, right? Like, the budget that I talked about earlier with the loophole closures, it's not $5 or $6 million. It's hundreds of millions of dollars of loophole closures. I mean, I can talk about in great chapter and verse detail, each one, but like another one is travel agents. I'm a lawyer, I pay B&O tax on my revenue at a 1.5% rate. Travel agents who are in the service business do not, they pay at a much lower rate. Now, this may have made sense in the old days when travel agents were being squeezed because there were mom and pop stores on the storefront. Nowadays, travel agents probably have names like Expedia. Like, this is not, and I don't know who gets the preference and who doesn't, but this is irrational, right? If engineers, architects, lawyers, doctors pay at 1.5% and travel agents get a special bump, and that irrationality is in the tens of millions of dollars. So you can stack up enough of those to really create some real money. You combine that with the temporary surcharge that we had in the recession, and you're looking at $1 billion that we could have put to the schools. So in any event, not to kind of go back to the fiscal questions, but those, this is not like some fake plan. This is an actual real bill that we really passed that would have really added $1 billion to the schools.
David, just real quick, I wanted to go back to something Mr. Hansen was talking about. I'll call it kind of micromanaging the educational process, but the STEM, whatever, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. I recently read something in the paper. It's talking about that 60% of the graduates that graduate from those particular STEM programs, and I assume in this state too, much that Mr. Hansen speaks about, end up not being employed in the field that they trained for. So back to the education and the reform of the education, we have a mismatch between what it is we're training people to do and what it is that industry needs to do. Closer partnership with industry as to what industry needs to have and programs they could have for training could take care of part of some of that. And finally, as far as the income tax, the voters made it very clear when Bill Gates gave his personal assurance that the income tax that was being proposed was just going to be on the rich. Well, the voters didn't buy it to the rate of 70%, and they said no income tax. So I'm of that school. We don't need an income tax. We need to live within our budget. Money's not the problem. It's how we're spending what it is we're having, we already have.
Okay. We're ready for our last question, so we'll give you each just a chance to, anything we haven't touched on that you think is important that you want to leave us with, or?
Can I address my colleague's suggestion about high demand degrees in fields that employers demand?
Yeah, why don't you do that and then give us the last statement and we'll let Jim finish up.
Okay, great. Thank you for doing this. This is always good fun, and thank you for paying attention, and I'm sure you get to do a lot of these, so I'm grateful for your time. I spent the entire summer working with Chad Magendaz, Republican of Issaquah, on how we crank out more computer science professionals in this state. And I started working on that about 2 years ago because I was talking to Avalara on Bainbridge Island and having some conversations with people around the Navy. And they have the same problems that Microsoft and Amazon do. I mean, they need more trained high-end software professionals. And our state can't produce them fast enough. And it's a real problem. And so we've been working all summer. We just had a big meeting on Friday with about 40 people there at Northeastern University to put together a strategic plan for how to address this critical shortage area in our state. And we're going to expand CS programs at the UW, Western, and Washington State University. We're going to do some work in course equivalency, like I just talked about, so we can get more kids taking computer science in the high school. We are going to do some work with out-of-the-box stuff, like a pure online competency-based computer science bachelor's degree at Western Governors University. But we're putting together a real bipartisan proposal that we're getting a lot of support from the business committee. We're getting a lot of interest in it from the universities. That's actually going to help kids get good jobs. And that's what I think you all and people in this district hire legislators to do. I've started on that work. I believe I actually mentioned it 2 years ago when I was here, that was something that I was going to do. I would love to continue it. I'd love to finish it. Because although I've only been in the legislature one full term, I have a track record of working across party lines on real, practical, common sense legislation that helps train people for decent jobs. And that's a good day's work. And I think it is useful and worthwhile, and I'll be very grateful for the opportunity to keep doing it.
Jim.
Okay. Well, once again, thanks for having us here. It's really important. Sometimes it's the campaigns are a little on the quiet side as far as what's going on and being able to speak to the people. I also appreciate the questions you propound, and I look forward to answering those. It's more valuable than this. I don't know. There's probably a brave soul or two that will look at this video or whatever. But I, again, am back to the need for reform. I mean, there's plenty of genuine good bills that are passed by legislators, and Mr. Hansen gave me a bunch of them that he's been working on, and that's really important. And not that I don't want to do good meat and potato bills to help, our local schools and things like that. I do want to do that, but I want to step back. I had experience with the Coast Guard, working with the Coast Guard in 2003 under Al Gore's plan to reform government. Coast Guard decided, it was good, that they were going to streamline, and they were going to do a I call stem to stern analysis of what it is they're doing, what are their core functions, do they need to do it, how much space they're renting. It was tough. It was a big, big, big task to done. But as a result, the taxpayers saved an incredible amount of money as far as lease spaces and more efficient means, and people moved around. So I think something like that, a variant on that, and nobody has the control as the Commandant did over the Coast Guard. The governor doesn't have that kind of control over Olympia. Olympia is more of a multi-headed monster. But I think that there will be a consensus, and when I get there, I'll find them, of people who believe that fundamental reform needs to go on, bipartisan. And as I said in my article in the paper, it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be painless. But that's what needs to be done. And by taking care of that, the most needy in our country, the 21,000 developmentally disabled people that have been languishing on the same list from 4 years ago to 2 years ago, and those soon will be meeting with them soon again, and who knows where the list will be, something is not going on. Something is not going on right as far as government. And again, we look at the Washington State Ferry and the problems they're having. We look at Big Bertha. You look at the lawsuits the Department of Social and Health Services had, and you look at the regulation bog down that we have. Things can improve, and if they improve, everybody benefits by that. Republicans, Democrats, the rich, and the poor, and that is what creates jobs. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys. Appreciate your time.